After the episode about the 50mm focal length that we did some time ago, one of the most requested topics that we've been asked to talk about in the channel was to talk about another lens that is widely used by loads of people, photojournalists, street photographers, documentary photographers, and of course that would be the 35mm focal length. But for this episode I wanted to do something a tiny bit different. I asked in the community, in YouTube and in the Raw Society members, what would be the thing that you wanted to know, that you always wanted to ask someone that uses the 35 a lot. So one of the things that people ask me a lot is why the 35? People tend to see it as something that is not very interesting, that is a little bit too normal. And I would say that regarding that side of it, that's precisely the point of the 35. So when we were talking about the 50, one of the things that we came with was the fact that with the 50, it's very interesting to use it because there is no deformation in the lines, there is no effect, there's nothing going on, everything looks very normal, but it's a little bit too tight. Therefore, the framing becomes very important, right? So the 35, in my opinion, what happens is that allows you a little bit more of things to be in the frame, therefore it becomes easier somehow, but still maintains this look that it's very normal. There are no artifices, there is no effects that are going to affect your photography in a very strange way, like would be like a 24. Therefore, yes, some people can call it boring, but that gives you something that is very important, at least to me, which would be coherence. So with a 35, I believe that you can get a tiny bit closer to people because you still have room to incorporate different things, different elements, and we will talk about being comfortable, being close to that later. But also stepping back a little bit, you have this room to explore, a landscape or some type of establishing shot, and it's practical in that sense. Of course, what's going to happen similarly to the 50 is that you will need to be solid as a photographer, right? There is no strange lines or vanishing points that are going to be very extreme. Therefore, your work with the geometry, the composition, the light, the moment is going to be more important than ever, right? Because there's no effect to cover something that is not fantastic. So that would be the one reason. So the strength of the 35 in this case is that it's very normal. That's a little bit the point of it. Something that is quite related to this actually is people ask me how to stand out if you're going to use a 35. Let's establish that now as a thing, you might have one camera, one lens, and the lens might be a 35 because, it's a small thing, you can travel with it, you can do a little bit of everything with it. But because it feels a little bit too normal, how to make your photography to stand out? Well, I would say that extra room that you have with your 35 instead of the 50 allows you to become a little bit more dynamic. It's when you start to be able to compose with a little bit of layers. At the same time, of course, you can do things like environmental portraits. Playing with the distances is something that will make your sequences, your bodies of work more rich, right? When we were talking about the 50, we were saying, okay, you have to take more pictures to get details, to get textures and things like that. In this case, it's the same idea. You still can do those things, but also you can play with complexity and dynamics and layers and simplicity as well to create more dynamics within the whole body of work. A little bit together with that idea on how to make your photography a little bit more powerful with a 35, I would say that your skills as a photographer, they need to be strong, they need to be solid, right? Beyond being able to put together some kind of essay, some kind of sequence that will make sense, I would say that having an understanding of how the relationship between yourself as photographer, the subject, and the space and the background needs to make sense, right? That way you can create different approaches to a street situation in which you might understand how the shadows and the light are hitting in a very specific way, and how you can make that space work in a way that is going to emphasize the subject, for example. It's easier, for example, with a 35 to start to get overlappings and things like that, which always are going to distract the attention of the viewer, and that's something that we don't want to have. So we have to pay a little bit more attention to the space. One of the things that I believe that it's interesting about the 35, or equivalent, of course, is that people tend to believe that it's just because of the looks. Some people think that 35 is too normal, but some people, they like what they can do with it. They see other photographers, they want to try to create more complex compositions and things like that, and to have a little bit more of the dynamics. But we have to have in an account something that is quite important, is that a focal length, beyond the aesthetics that you can achieve with it, it's very important to be aware that you will need to be at certain distances to the subject, right? With a 35, I would say that you have to be comfortable being around 3 meters or so from any given scene. For me, that's something that works very well, because that's part of what I want to show to my audience. And at the end, we are speaking to an audience that's not necessarily a photographer. They need to understand what's going on without you being explicit, or without them having a deep knowledge about how to compose with layers and things like that. I would say that if you have in an account your own personality, if you're one of those people that likes to be close to the action, that you want to be not engaging with the action, but you want to be involved in the whole thing, to translate that to your audience, I would say that 35 is the great. Because you are not so close that the engagement, instead of being with the audience, is with you as photographer, but you are close enough to give that sense of being there. That to me and to many other photographers is quite important. But if you think that you are not there yet, or you just don't like to engage so much with a given situation, there's nothing wrong with you using another lens, using a 50 or a 40. So one of the things that I believe that it's important in any kind of photography, especially in documentary and street photography, is to be selective. Be very intentional when you frame, and how you compose, and how you want to have your story unfold, right? To be sequenced. I would say that the 50 forces you to be very selective, and a good thing about the 35 is that allows you to be a little bit less selective, if you want, with the framing. That gives you room to create certain composition that can be more complex or more dynamic. But be aware that when we talk about complexity and layers and that kind of thing, we have to be very conscious that a complicated picture, it's great, but we don't need to be complex all the time in our sequence or in our body of work. This is something that's important when you're going to use something that allows you to do that type of work, right? And I always use an analogy that I think it works pretty well. Think about an essay or a body of work as a song, right? A rock song. You will notice that when you are listening to any kind of Jimi Hendrix, whatever it is, you will see that there is a peak of the song that would be the guitar solo, for example. It's going to be this peak, it's going to be very attention-grabby, exciting, all that stuff. But also we have to leave room to the lyrics and the rest of the instruments in a song to have the full potential and the audience can go through the whole dynamics of it. With a sequence happens the same thing. Your complex picture, your very layered and complicated color combination and geometry, that's your guitar solo. But you also need the rest. You need the lyrics. You need the rhythm that goes with any kind of narrative. Okay, let's talk about the practical aspect of it. I know that many of you, when you think about using a 35, especially for the first few times, besides being like a small lens that's interesting to do a little bit of everything, one of the things that people try to do with it is to do these layered pictures, right? These complex compositions that people like Alex Webb, Charles Harwood, these kind of photographers are known of doing. So I will give you a couple of interesting tips that to me are something that are useful. And with that in mind, let's talk about first of the most important aspect of that type of photography, which is being patient. Usually how this works is something quite interesting to me, because layered photography, usually when you are dealing with more than one subject and different elements in a frame, you are losing something that you gain with other types of photography, which is lots of expressions. You can have them, of course, but the point of a layered picture, I would argue, that it's more related to the location and to the dynamics and the relationship between the people that it's in the frame, and the subjects, and the space, than any given emotion that you can find in a particular phase in the frame. Therefore, we have to be aware that a layered picture is almost like establishing shot. We are establishing what type of atmosphere and dynamics you can find in a given place, right? How people interact with each other and that type of thing. That being said, going back to the idea of patience, one of the best ways of starting to do layered pictures is to find the location first. You have heard me probably in this channel and other people talking about this idea of finding a place that can have a possibility of a picture, right? You find an interesting corner in which the color of the background and the light is working very well, and you observe there are some people coming and going, and there are certain interactions in there. You can tell there is something happening all the time. That's the place that you want to find to do a layered picture. But usually we work the other way, right? We go around, either if we are doing just street photography or we are doing some kind of body of work, some kind of project, we look for the subject first. So it can feel a little bit counterintuitive, right? Now we are saying, okay, find first the background and the possibilities of that background. Once you find that, you pretty much have just to wait there. Keep in mind, you already know that probably something will happen because you have been observing and you've been patient. Therefore, the possibility of that picture, it's high in probability, right? So with that in mind, I would say find the background and start to compose the picture from the backgrounds towards you, right? When you want a layered picture, what you are looking for pretty much is to have a sense of depth besides the dynamics and the action that you can photograph, is the sense of depth. Therefore, you start with the background, and then you might add to your frame someone that's smoking a cigarette in a corner or waiting for a taxi, whatever it is, someone that's a little bit stationary, right? Then maybe you look for something that is in the foreground, right? Something that is closer to you. That allows you to have space to put the main subject in the middle ground is the best option. Because if you prepare well for it, you can leave one of the thirds, we are talking about rule of thirds here, one of the thirds open to that main subject, that interesting, that starting point that we all need in a picture for the viewer to be guided through that complicated composition. So that would be the first tip to develop any kind of complex composition, would be start from the background and work towards you. And of course, be patient. That's one of the first rules. Background, foreground, and middle ground. And the space, the background itself, it's also a subject. You have to find an account that the light must be interesting and must have quality in all of those three layers. I would say that the 35 it's very popular among photojournalists and documentary photographers and street photographers for a good reason. It's because it's a focal length that is quite versatile. What also gives you the 35, it's a sense of coherence. What gives you is the sense that there is a sense of narrative with your photography, because you want to have a specific kind of style that you want to develop and practice. Maybe you want to have coherence because you want to have a very specific type of atmosphere for a project or for a body of work. But coherence anyway is something that it's important, because when you show that project to someone, and at the end that's what we want to do as authors, is to show something to someone else, they will find a vibrant dynamics, an interesting story maybe, but everything will look from the same perspective, which is yours. I would suggest that style is not really something that you achieve through a lens, like a 35 or a 50 or whatever it is. Style, a personal voice, as people call it, emerges from your point of view, emerges from what are you interested in, how you explain yourself, how you find a story that for some other author can be something that they didn't see, but you see it. That's the style of a photographer. So in this case, the 35 would be just a tool, which is what it is. It's just a tool that allows you to achieve those different things, to put together something that makes sense in a specific way, in a way that you want to.